All I know is that I am not a Marxist. Karl Marx. So Marxism has a lot to say about a lot of things, and Marxists themselves often have differing explanations, opinions, and ideas. Since a short presentation can't go super in-depth, this will just be a broad primer that hopefully gets everyone on roughly the same page about what Marxism represents, so that when people use the terms Marxist or Marxism, you at least have a basic understanding of what that term means. The main things we'll be going over are: where does Marxism come from? What defines Marxism? And what is Marxism's influence on the socialist movement? So where did Marxism come from? Marxism is a method of social analysis that originated in the 1800s and is based on the work and theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. While Marx was a prominent writer, philosopher, economist, and revolutionary, most people are familiar with him as the most well-known socialist in history thanks to his authoring of the Communist Manifesto. Marx's work was unique because it focused on grounding the socialist struggle against capitalism in a scientific framework based on material observation. He believed the path to socialism needed to be based in the world as it materially existed, as opposed to the idealistic strategies and tactics of numerous utopian socialists of his day. This is why he called his methodology scientific socialism, which today is still synonymous with Marxism. Marx's work wouldn't gain popular prominence as a distinct political ideology till after Marx's death, and as was indicated by the opening quote, Marx was very anti-dogmatic in regards to people adopting his ideas and never promoted them as an ideology, but rather he viewed his theories as a scientific way of analyzing society and social change. While Marx laid the foundation for his method of analysis, his ideas and theories would be expanded on and developed further by future Marxist theorists and revolutionaries. To this day, Marxism maintains this dynamic tradition of analyzing changing conditions and new information to produce more nuanced and better developed conclusions about the nature of oppression and social change. So what defines Marxism? This is the Wikipedia definition of Marxism, and it's actually pretty concise. So we'll use it and break it down to address its core parts. Marxism is a method of socio-economic analysis that views class relations and social conflict using a materialist interpretation of historical development and takes a dialectical view of social transformation. So Marxism is based in class struggle, materialism, and dialectical analysis. Okay, let's look at principle number 1, class struggle. The Marxist definition of class struggle is that within most societies, there is a division of power and labor that places people into two primary classes that are in material opposition to each other. While in most mainstream discourse, class is primarily used to define a person's level of wealth, that's not how Marxism analyzes and defines class. Marxism defines class as being based on a person's relationship to the division of labor and control of resources within a society. Marxism sees power dynamics within a society as being defined primarily by two things: who's doing the work to produce the things society wants and needs, and who controls the resources needed to do that work, also called the means of production. The ones who control the resources are the dominant or ruling class, while those relegated to doing the labor are the subordinate or working class. In ancient pre-feudal empire societies, this class dynamic was expressed through the master and slave mode of production. In feudalism, it was expressed through the class dynamic of the lord and serf or peasant mode of production. And today, under capitalism, the class dynamic is that of the capitalist and worker mode of production. Based on this distinction, Marxism sees the mechanics of class conflict as central to a transition to socialism. The ruling class can only maintain its existence through the exploitation and the oppression of the working class. Therefore, the liberation of the working class can only be achieved by abolishing the ruling class through a societal transition out of capitalism and towards a democratic, worker-controlled system, aka socialism. Now let's look at principle number 2, materialism. Marxism is rooted in materialism, which means it sees the dominant force shaping all human development and activity as being the physical conditions of the material world in which we all live. Again, while most people tend to think of materialism as an obsession with possessions, Marxism doesn't define materialism in this way. Materialism means seeing the world fundamentally as being based on a reality made up of physical matter, where all human activity is subject to the material conditions of their environment. This is opposed to idealism, which is when we see our ideas and perceptions as the dominant force in shaping how the world works and operates. Now, Marxism acknowledges that our individual ideas, decisions, and actions can influence our environment, but concludes that our ability to form these ideas, make these decisions, and to act on them is ultimately dependent on the existing material conditions of our environment. You can't build a house without proper materials and tools. You can't make ice without water. Or more relevantly, you can't create a business that makes you the wealthiest person on the planet without thousands of workers physically doing the labor of implementing your ideas and decisions. The popular capitalist trope of, "I created all my wealth myself, so I deserve to have it," is one of the best examples of idealism, which ignores the material reality of physically needing workers to do the work. So Marxism is fundamentally materialist. And finally, we have principle number 3, dialectical analysis. Marxism uses a dialectical approach to its method of analysis, meaning it sees everything as being in a constant state of change, and that determining truth requires investigating and analyzing the inherent conflicts and contradictions that exist within and between all things. Put simply, to analyze something dialectically means to analyze it critically, addressing the contradictions and conflicts that exist both within and outside of it to determine its true nature. Here's a simple example of a dialectical analysis. We'll start with a claim. The U.S. was founded on freedom, democracy, and equality, which we will then contrast with the following contradictions to determine its legitimacy. Founders were mostly slave owners. The economy was primarily based on slave labor. And you couldn't vote if you weren't a white property-owning man. When you combine dialectical analysis with materialism, you get what Marxists call dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism is the concept that people's thoughts, characteristics, and actions are constantly being shaped by the material conditions in the world around them. Marx used dialectical materialism to describe the way societies structure themselves by dividing them into two primary parts with specific functions. The economic base, which is defined by how a society arranges itself economically and produces what it wants and needs. This base, in turn, allows for the society to form its social ideologies, like religion, politics, culture, and laws, which Marx called the superstructure. It's this superstructure that, in turn, legitimizes the type of economic base a society uses to support itself. While this is a reciprocal relationship, as represented by the graphic, the dominant portion in this dynamic is still the material conditions needed to form the economic base in the first place. A good example of this dynamic can be seen in the relationship between the enslavement of black people and the formation of white supremacist ideology in the early U.S. The early United States economy needed the economic base of slave labor to exist, so the resulting superstructure formed the ideology of white supremacy to legitimize the enslavement of black people. This continued economic dependency on slave labor then continued to reinforce the ideology of white supremacy, which reinforced the legitimacy of using black people as slaves, etc., etc. This form of social analysis can be applied to countless forms of systemic oppression that exist under the capitalist system to better understand how they operate and inform how we might effectively dismantle them. If you take dialectical materialism and apply it to historical development, you get what Marxism calls historical materialism. Historical materialism observes society as always being in a state of change based on the different material forces acting within and against it. Historical materialism thus frames major changes in human history as driven primarily by major material conflicts and contradictions attempting to resolve themselves. Historical materialism advocates that the structure of a society is only able to maintain itself when there is a balance between the economic base and the ideological superstructure. If the economic base can no longer provide the necessary material support required by the superstructure, or if the superstructure is no longer able to legitimize maintaining the existing mode of economic production, the society will cease to function and must either make a revolutionary transition to a new system or face collapse. Marxism sees the transition from one form of society to another as the playing out of this base superstructure dynamic. Large slave empires, like the Western Roman Empire, collapsed under the instability of their overly oppressive socioeconomic systems, which then gave rise to the systemic hierarchies of medieval feudalism, which would eventually be overthrown by a rising merchant class through a series of revolutions to usher in the next dominant system, capitalism. Marxism proposes that the end of capitalism will also be inevitable as the structural contradictions between the base and the superstructure become unsustainable, and that we will be faced with the same scenario as previous societies, either a transition to a more sustainable system, socialism, or face a violent societal collapse of some form or another. So in conclusion, historical materialism proposes that human history and development is the playing out of the material relationship between the economic base and the ideological superstructure within societies, and that all advancement, change, and progress in human societies is the result of material forces acting on it and subject to the material limitations of its available resources, technology, and mode of production, i.e. slavery, feudalism, capitalism, etc. Marxism places these material and dialectical observations at the center of the struggle for building socialism, and believes that any tactic or strategy we employ must take them into account to be successful. Marxism's influence on socialism. Needless to say, every modern socialist and socialist movement, regardless of whether or not they are explicitly Marxist, has been immensely influenced by Marx's ideas and theories. Marxism's mark can be seen literally everywhere in socialist rhetoric and terminology, and so much of what is considered the fundamentals of socialist political ideology has its roots in Marxism. Some examples are our understanding of the working class struggle, and class consciousness, the mechanics of how our workers' labor is exploited under capitalism, the mechanics and nature of large-scale revolutionary change, capitalism's role in imperialism and war and its relationship with the state, capitalism's role and influence in systemic racism and patriarchy, the unstable and unsustainable structure of the capitalist system and its tendency to crisis and environmental destruction. In closing, I want to remind everyone that there are a lot of Marxist ideas and concepts that were not covered in this presentation, and I highly encourage you to learn more by exploring the massive wealth of information available both on the internet, in countless books, and also in the minds of your fellow comrades, who many probably identify as Marxists. And with that, I will leave you with one of Marx's most famous quotes. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it.